Medieval life is commonly associated with images of knights clad in armor, kings sitting on ornate thrones, or peasants toiling in muddy fields. But what about the medieval kitchen? What was it really like to cook and eat in the Middle Ages? Well, before we had ovens with knobs or stovetops that lit with the push of a button, there was the hearth, a smoky, smoldering, and central fixture of every medieval household. The layout of the medieval kitchen may surprise you. Before I tell you about them, let me tell you something about the kitchen. Now, not a kitchen in the modern sense, not even really a room of its own. It was simply a place where fire lived, a fire that never truly went out, because if it did, everything stopped. In the early medieval period, the hearth was the heart architecturally, socially, spiritually. Usually placed in the center of a one-room home, it was both cooking surface and heat source, surrounded by smoke-blackened timbers and the slow drip of creosote that formed on the rafters above. Chimneys, that hallmark of kitchen imagery, were not common until much later. For centuries, smoke was allowed to drift freely up through a hole in the roof or simply swirl around the room until it found its way out or into one's lungs. In this cozy, intimate setting, food was prepared using simple earthenware pots, cast iron pans, and heavy wooden bowls and platters. Meals consisted of a variety of meats, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables, although the specific dishes varied depending on the season and the region. Hearty stews and soups were common, as were roasted poultry and game. The lack of refrigeration meant that food had to be consumed promptly after preparation, and any leftovers were likely to be saved for the next day. Eating was often done with one's hands, and utensils were used sparingly. Now, let us take a closer look at the types of food that were commonly eaten in the Middle Ages. Breakfast was typically a light meal consisting of bread, cheese, and ale. Lunch was often eaten on the go and might consist of whatever was available, such as bread, fruit, or nuts. Dinner was the largest meal of the day and might include a variety of dishes such as roasted meat, fish, bread, vegetables, and fruit. Medieval cuisine was heavily influenced by local and seasonal ingredients, and different regions had their own specialties. For example, France was known for its sauces and pastries, while Italy was famous for its pasta and pizza. But don't be fooled by the cozy description. Cooking in the medieval kitchen was not easy. There were no fancy gadgets or modern conveniences. Everything had to be done by hand. It took a lot of time and effort to prepare a meal. The medieval cook had to chop vegetables by hand, start a fire, and tend to it constantly. There were no matches or lighters, so starting a fire was a bit of a chore. Flint and steel, bow drill, bamboo, and fire saw were all used to get the job done. Once the fire was started, it had to be kept going. This meant that someone was always on duty to add fuel to the fire and make sure it didn't go out. If the fire went out, it was difficult to start again, and there was a risk that food would spoil. In addition, the medieval kitchen was often crowded and hot. All of the cooking was done over an open fire, which meant that the kitchen was usually filled with smoke. This, combined with the fact that there was often a shortage of fuel, meant that cooking was a challenging and unpleasant task. Despite the challenges, cooking was an important part of life in the medieval kitchen. It was not only a means of sustenance, but also a way of bringing people together. Meals were often shared with family and friends, and food was an important part of celebrations and festivals. Cooking was also an important part of medieval culture. There were many cookbooks and recipes that were passed down through generations. These cookbooks often included not only recipes, but also information on table manners and etiquette. Overall, the medieval kitchen was a fascinating and important part of medieval life. Although it was not a comfortable or convenient place to work, it was the heart of the home and the place where families came together to eat and socialize. Cooking is hard. Ask anyone who's ever tried to master a recipe or baked an elaborate cake or grilled chicken that was then instantly incinerated. So it is with our food. Now, let's go back to a time before non-stick pans, electric mixers, microwaves, food processors, slow cookers, or coffee grinders. Welcome to the medieval kitchen. Or more accurately, the medieval cooking hearth. Here time has its own pace and culinary challenges abound. In the world of the medieval kitchen, or more accurately, the medieval cooking hearth, there was no drawer full of stainless steel implements. No non-stick pans, no electric mixers. The tools available to the average cook were simple, few, and deeply worn. But each bore the memory of meals past, and each had its place in the daily struggle to turn raw ingredients into something edible, or even on the rarest of days something enjoyable. For the vast majority of medieval people, cooking tools were not standardized. They were passed down, handmade, or scavenged. An iron pot might serve 3 generations. A wooden spoon, carved with a dull blade on a winter's evening, might stir hundreds of stews before finally cracking from the heat. There were no sets, there were no matching anything. The most important tool of all was the pot, usually made of cast iron, sometimes of copper or bronze for the wealthier. It was deep, heavy, and rounded at the bottom to nestle easily among hot embers. It could hang from a metal hook or rest on a trivet above the coals. In it went everything: vegetables, barley, dried peas, bones for broth, a chunk of meat if one was lucky. The pot was never scrubbed clean the way we might clean today. A certain amount of residue was not only tolerated, it was expected. Seasoned, as one might call it now, but in truth it was just difficult to keep clean without hot running water. Spits were more aspirational. To own a proper spit, made of wrought iron and balanced with some precision, meant you had something worth roasting. Most peasants never roasted large animals. They boiled, they simmered, they griddled on flat stones or simple iron plates. But where roasting was possible, a spit was a marvel of rotating efficiency. In noble houses, servants might be tasked with turning the spit for hours, their arms aching, eyes watering from the smoke. And in some wealthier kitchens, the spit was turned by mechanical means, a rotating wheel powered by weights, or, more cruelly, by a dog running inside a wheel on the wall. The turnspit dog was small and quick, chosen specifically for its utility in this unusual labor. Spoons, mostly wooden, were omnipresent. There were long ones for stirring, shorter ones for serving, and some even carved with decorative handles. A single spoon might serve multiple tasks: stirring pottage, tasting broth, transferring ingredients. Metal spoons existed but were less common among the lower classes. Even fewer had forks. Forks, in fact, were controversial in parts of medieval Europe, seen as a sign of decadence or worse, of impiety. Why pierce God's creation with prongs when fingers would suffice? Knives were essential, not just for cooking, but for eating. Most people carried their own knives, sheathed at their belt, used both at the hearth and the table. These were not chef's knives as we know them, but small, all-purpose blades. They cut meat, sliced bread, skinned vegetables, cleaned fish. The same knife used for cutting onions might later be used for whittling a peg or trimming a bootlace. For storing and serving, there were earthenware pots and bowls. These were often made by local potters, thick and rustic, prone to cracking if dropped. Glazes were rare at the peasant level. They absorbed flavor, sometimes to a fault, and could not be scrubbed too harshly for fear of crumbling. The ware was porous, and over time it held on to the memory of meals in a literal way, smelling faintly of last week as onions or yesterday as cabbage broth. Skimmers, ladles, and strainers also had their place, though many were makeshift, woven from twigs, carved from bone, or repurposed from other tools. A fire poker might double as a bread turner. A bent piece of iron could function as a crude whisk. In castles and monasteries, the tool set was richer. There were mortar and pestle sets for grinding spices, some of marble or stone. There were molds for jellied meats or pastries, intricate and often carved with heraldic designs. There were iron tongs, long enough to reach into the deepest oven or grab a hot pan from the coals. These were tools of status as much as utility. But even in such places, the cooking was grueling, hot, smoke-filled, and dangerous. Scalds and burns were constant threats. Tools helped, but they did not make the job easy. One curious implement was the posnet, a small metal pot with legs, designed to sit directly in embers. It had a handle for lifting and was used for sauces or small batches of food. It allowed cooks to work on multiple dishes at once. In a kind of proto-multitasking that required sharp attention and agile hands. It's easy now to look back and marvel at the simplicity of these tools. But it was precisely that simplicity that made cooking both so difficult and so human. Every spoonful stirred required judgment. Every flip of a cake, a test of instinct. There were no printed measurements, no standard units. A pinch was what fit between your fingers. A handful was what your hand could hold. Time was not kept in minutes, but in verses of a psalm or the way sunlight slanted through a window. The tools shaped the food, and the food shaped the life. Meals took hours, not because the recipes were complex, but because the tools demanded patience. Water had to be drawn. Fire coaxed to life. Heat slowly built. Utensils arranged. Ingredients prepared. There was no rush, but neither was there leisure. It was simply the pace of survival. In those battered pots and soot-blackened spoons were the quiet engineers of medieval sustenance. The wooden ladle that stirred through years of hunger and harvest. The iron knife that cut through a turnip one morning and defended a household the next. They weren't just cooking tools. They were lifelines. And despite the harshness, these tools served, not with perfection, but with persistence. Bent, cracked, charred but still used, still trusted, and still passed on. It would be a grave mistake to imagine medieval cuisine as a collection of hearty roasts and golden pies, as painted in the banquet scenes of later centuries. For most people in medieval Europe, the daily meal was not a feast. It was pottage or gruel, or a ladle of something so humble and so bland it scarcely rose above the level of survival. And yet this was the food that sustained an entire civilization, slowly stirred, slowly chewed, and slowly digested. At the core of the medieval diet, particularly for peasants and laborers, was pottage. Not quite a soup, not quite a stew. Thick when possible, thin when ingredients ran low. It was made in the same pot day after day with whatever ingredients were on hand. Barley, oats, leeks, onions, garlic, carrots, and cabbages, these were common. Lentils or beans if one was lucky. Meat, rarely. Salt, when available. Herbs, if you knew where to forage. Spices? Forget it. For most, those were out of reach. The pottage pot was rarely emptied entirely. Leftovers were kept in the pot, and more ingredients added as they came. It was, in effect, a perpetual meal, one that evolved over time. If a rabbit was caught, it went into the pottage. If a neighbor brought over some greens, those too were added. Sometimes there was barley, sometimes oats, sometimes only turnip greens and water. Every day it was reheated, stirred, thickened, or thinned. In this way, the pottage became less a recipe and more a rhythm. Gruel, by comparison, was even simpler. Thin, watery, often just grains boiled in water or milk when available. It was a breakfast food, a recovery food, a food for the poor and sick and young. It offered energy, if not much pleasure. But in a world where calories mattered more than flavor, gruel served its purpose. The idea of 3 meals a day did not hold. Breakfast was usually skipped unless one rose early for work and needed strength. Dinner taken around midday was the main meal. Supper, eaten before sunset, was lighter. And often all 3 meals might feature the same dish, simply reheated. Bread, of course, played a major supporting role. For those who could afford it, a chunk of coarse bread was served with nearly every meal. Made from rye, barley, or sometimes a mix of grains, this bread was nothing like modern loaves. It was dense, dark, and often sour. Sometimes the flour was mixed with peas or acorns during hard times. There was even a term for such desperation famine bread. It was gritty and hard, and sometimes even dangerous to teeth and digestion. For the lowest classes, baking bread at home wasn't always possible. Communal ovens found in villages were used by many families. One might prepare dough at home and then bring it to the baker or oven keeper, who charged a fee or took a portion as payment. It was not uncommon for villagers to mark their loaves with a personal symbol scratched or pressed into the dough to identify their bread among many. Dairy was part of the diet too, but in humble forms. Milk from cows or goats spoiled quickly, so it was often turned into cheese or butter. Soft cheeses were common, aged cheeses rarer. In monasteries, cheese-making became something of an art. But for the average household, cheese was a way to preserve milk, not a luxury item. Meat was elusive. Even in agricultural villages where animals were raised, meat was not eaten regularly. Livestock was too valuable alive. Chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk, sheep gave wool. Only when an animal was old, sick, or part of a feast would it be slaughtered. Pigs were more commonly eaten, as they foraged easily and could be fattened with scraps. Still, meat was reserved for special occasions or winter provisions. Fish filled some of the gap, especially in coastal or river regions. Salted herring, dried cod, and smoked eels were staples of the monastic and urban diet. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden and fish became the main protein. But again, how fresh, how abundant, and how well prepared depended entirely on where you lived and what you could afford. Eggs were another occasional luxury. Chickens were kept by many households, but eggs were often used sparingly. A single egg might be added to a pottage or used in a cake only during celebrations. It was more common to trade eggs than to eat them regularly. Vegetables were seasonal and variable, leafy greens in spring, beans in summer, root vegetables in winter. Preservation methods included drying, salting, pickling, and in later centuries, storing in cool cellars. Fermentation played a small role. Sauerkraut, for example, existed long before refrigeration. Fruits were eaten in season and often cooked into tarts or boiled into sauces. Apples, pears, plums, and berries were common in temperate climates, but they spoiled quickly. Apples could be stored in straw or hung from rafters to last through the colder months. Dried fruits were rare and expensive. And then there was ale, arguably the most consumed liquid in the medieval world. Water was not always clean. Ale, brewed with boiled water, was safer. It was weak by modern standards, but full of calories and considered a food in its own right. Even children drank it. In monasteries, stronger ale was brewed and rationed by the pint. In towns, alewives managed brewing operations from their homes, sometimes creating an entire local economy from the task. In wealthier households, the diet expanded. Spices, imported at great cost, made their way into sauces and meat dishes. Sugar, a true rarity, was prized and used in small quantities. Rice might appear on noble tables, along with almonds, dates, and saffron. Feasts became performances, where food was meant to impress. Peacocks roasted in their feathers, pies filled with songbirds, and jellied meats were not uncommon among the elite. But this was not the reality for most. For most, food was fuel. It was brown or gray or greenish. It was warm if you were lucky, bland if you could afford it, and it was life day after day in its simplest form. Still, there was a certain dignity in this monotony, in the quiet act of stirring a pot while children played near the hearth, in the scraping together of a meal from whatever the garden offered, in the careful preservation of a single egg for a holy day. These foods may not have dazzled, but they endured. Pottage and gruel were not culinary triumphs, but they were the scaffolding of medieval existence, built one ladle at a time, eaten without ceremony, forgotten except in the memory of hunger satisfied. In the absence of refrigeration, the medieval diet was seasonal, depended on storage and preservation techniques, and above all else, it relied on fire. Before one could cook in the Middle Ages, before the pot was hung or the griddle heated, before even the grain was ground or the bread was baked, there was the matter of fire, and behind fire always was fuel. Firewood was the quiet currency of medieval life. It was not merely a resource. It was an ever-present necessity, an invisible labor woven into every bite of food consumed. Cooking was impossible without it, yet most history barely mentions the drudgery that came with maintaining a steady supply. To run out of firewood was to stop cooking, stop heating, and slowly surrender to cold, hunger, and silence. For most rural households, collecting firewood was a daily task. It was not glamorous, but it was as essential as drawing water or tending animals. Boys and girls, mothers and servants, old men with bent backs all walked the footpaths and forest edges in search of twigs, branches, and logs. Even small pieces mattered. Kindling had to be dry. Larger logs had to be seasoned. Nothing too green, nothing too damp. All of it had to be gathered, chopped, stacked, protected. The right wood made the right fire. Oak was prized for its long burn, ash for its easy lighting. Hazel, birch, and elm had their uses too. But pine was avoided when possible. It burned too fast, and smoky pitch clung to everything. Peat was used in regions where trees were scarce. Dried animal dung, too, was used in desperate seasons or in treeless areas like parts of the Scottish Highlands. It was not elegant, but it worked. The average peasant household required staggering amounts of firewood over the course of a year. It heated the hearth for cooking. It warmed the room on winter nights. It boiled water, dried clothes, warded off illness. Without central heating, without ovens or chimneys or insulation, firewood was the single line between life and frostbite. But owning firewood was not always easy. In feudal society, the woods were rarely free. Most forests were owned by lords, monasteries, or the crown. Rights of use were highly regulated. Peasants might be allowed to gather fallen branches, a right called a stover, but could not cut live trees. Fines were imposed on those who broke the rules. There were forest wardens tasked with patrolling the boundaries, and even in some regions, laws as harsh as blinding or mutilation for poaching valuable timber. So people learned to be cautious. Children crept through underbrush with baskets. Women carried bundles of twigs tied in rags. The best firewood was hidden under the folds of cloaks or passed from hand to hand in barter. A dry log might be worth more than a loaf of bread in a harsh winter, and firewood wasn't only used in homes. Communal bread ovens, blacksmith forges, bathhouses, and breweries all required enormous quantities of fuel. In towns and manors, wood had to be purchased or carted in. Forest management became a political concern in some regions. Lords imposed cutting restrictions to protect their own timber. Entire villages were fined or punished for stripping too much bark or leaving stumps. In monasteries and castles, firewood was organized with the same precision as food stores or wine cellars. Large stacks were maintained, sorted by size and dryness. Some households had dedicated woodcutters and charcoal burners specialists who transformed wood into more manageable fuel. Charcoal, though labor-intensive to make, burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood. It was used in wealthier kitchens or in urban areas where smoke from wood fires became intolerable. The process of making charcoal was slow and oddly delicate. Wood was stacked in a precise mound, then covered in turf and soil. It was lit slowly and allowed to smolder, not flame, for several days. Too much air, and the wood would burn to ash. Too little, and it would never transform. Once ready, it was stored and sold to those who could afford the luxury. For most, though, the daily fire was built from what could be carried. Bundles were stacked near the hearth, dried indoors, protected from rain. A fire was started with dried moss, flint, steel, and patience. Sparks were coaxed into flame, flames into coals. Bread could not be baked until the fire was ready. Stew could not simmer. Cheese could not be melted. Every task began with flame, and every flame began with fuel. There were entire rhythms built around fire. Ashes were raked in the morning. Coals were banked at night. Children were warned to keep the fire from dying. Wives stirred it, added logs, tested heat with their palms. Meals failed when firewood failed. Cakes burned or remained uncooked. Porridge stuck to cold pots. Meat spoiled because it could not be cooked in time. Firewood shortage was a food shortage. The smell of burning wood was part of daily life. It clung to clothes, hair, bread, cheese. Soot painted the rafters, blackened the pots, drifted in beams of sunlight. Smoke was not avoided. It was expected. Chimneys came late. Most homes had only a hole in the roof or a small vent. Smoke swirled in the air, stung the eyes, made people cough. But without fire, there was no kitchen. And in winter, the stakes were even higher. Cold mornings meant stiff fingers. Damp wood meant smoke, not heat. A fire that went out in the night had to be rekindled from scratch, slow, frustrating, dangerous. In deep cold, people huddled by the embers. Meals grew simpler, smaller, wood had to be rationed. There are records quiet, tragic, overlooked of winters where firewood ran out, of households reduced to burning furniture, of families abandoning homes because no trees remained nearby. In those cases, the land had failed them, but sometimes the law had too. The economy of firewood was not just about trees. It was about labor, rights, survival, and control. Who could cut? Who could carry? Who could afford? and who, when the wind howled through the thatch roof, still had enough to cook a meal, however humble, before the fire turned cold. In the tapestry of medieval life, few threads are as enduring as bread. For the medieval peasant, a life without bread was unimaginable. To imagine bread without ovens is to try and picture snow without cold. Yet for much of the medieval world, especially among peasants, tenants and villagers, bread was made, baked, and eaten without the kind of oven we imagine today. No cast iron doors, no thermostats, no cozy brick hearths. Instead, baking was a ritual of ashes, embers, flat stones, smoke, and time-honored improvisation. In this unforgiving world, bread was not merely a food. It was the foundation of the medieval diet, often making up 60 to 80% of a person's daily caloric intake. But making it was not simply a matter of mixing dough and baking it. For those without access to a communal oven or personal hearth designed for baking, it was a daily labor of ingenuity. The simplest method was to bake directly on or in the fire. A flatbread could be laid upon a hot stone placed in the ashes of the fire. The dough, made from barley, rye, or sometimes oats, would sizzle and cook unevenly. There was no rise, no fluff. It was dense, sometimes scorched, sometimes underdone in the center, but it was bread. A little warmth, a little chew, something to hold the stew or sop up broth. Sometimes ashes clung to it. No one cared. That was simply how it was done. Another technique was to rake the embers aside, lay the dough on the hearthstone, and cover it over with hot ashes and coals. After a time, the bread would be uncovered, now blackened on the outside, but cooked through. It would be knocked clean with the side of a knife, dusted by hand, and eaten with little ceremony. This was known as ash baking, and while it sounds primitive, it persisted for centuries, particularly in isolated or impoverished regions. For the slightly better off, baking might involve an iron griddle or a small domed oven known as a clibinus, essentially a portable clay lid placed over the dough. Heated first over the fire, the clibinus trapped heat and reflected it downward, simulating an oven effect. The results were better, still rustic, but more evenly cooked. In towns and villages, however, a more communal method emerged, the public bake oven. These were large, dome-shaped structures made of stone or clay, built by the lord, the monastery, or the town itself. They burned hot, sometimes for hours until the walls radiated heat. The ashes and embers were swept out and bread loaves were inserted on long-handled paddles. The residual heat baked the loaves from all sides. It was efficient but not free. Peasants were rarely allowed to use these ovens without permission. The right to bake in the Lord's oven was called banal, right from the French banalite, and it came with a fee. Sometimes a coin, sometimes a portion of the dough or a share of the finished bread. Some lords even claimed a monopoly on baking entirely, making it illegal for peasants to construct their own ovens. To bake in secret could bring fines or worse. Thus, bread baking became entangled in law, economy, and survival. A woman might wake before dawn to knead dough by candlelight. She might carry it miles to the nearest oven. She might wait in line behind neighbors, hoping the fire still held enough heat. She might return home hours later, her arms full of heavy loaves, knowing that one or two must be given to the steward or priest. The bread itself varied depending on class and region. White bread, made from fine wheat flour, was reserved for the rich. It was sifted through cloth or hair sieves to remove the bran. The result was pale, soft, and highly valued. Brown bread, often coarse and flecked with husk, was for the rest. Rye bread was common in colder regions. Barley bread, with its dry, crumbly texture, was widely disliked but widely eaten. Oat cakes, especially in Scotland and the north, were ubiquitous. Famine bread, however, told the darker stories. In times of scarcity, people stretched flour with whatever they could find: pea flour, bean flour, chestnuts, acorns. In the worst years, even bark and sawdust found their way into loaves. There were accounts of bread so dense it cracked teeth, so bitter it had to be choked down with ale, and so poor it caused illness. For those who could bake properly, the rhythm was weekly. 1 or 2 large baking days. Dough kneaded in wooden troughs, covered in cloth, left to rise by the fire. The loaves shaped and scored with patterns not only for decoration, but as identifying marks essential in communal ovens. Some used initials, others simple crosses or symbols. Each family's mark was known and respected. In monasteries, bread was made on a scale most peasants could scarcely imagine. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of loaves a day. Kneading was done by lay brothers or kitchen servants. The ovens were immense, the paddles long, the heat managed by experienced hands. Bread here could be blessed, portioned, and distributed not just to monks, but to pilgrims, paupers, and the sick. Even in castles, bread had its place. Trenchers, fixed slabs of stale bread, were used as plates for meat and sauce. By the end of a meal, the trencher was soaked through. The rich might discard it, the servants might eat it, or it might be given to the poor waiting at the gate. But in the peasant home, bread was more precious. It was hoarded, wrapped in cloth, stored in chests to protect it from mice. The scent of fresh bread, however crude, was a moment of joy in a harsh life. Children were given crusts to chew. Workers took hunks of it into the fields. It was dipped in ale, crumbled into pottage, or simply eaten plain. There was reverence, too. Bread was the body of Christ, after all. It was not to be wasted. Dropped pieces were picked up, crumbs gathered. Crosses marked into the dough before baking. Blessings whispered. So while we think of ovens as the centerpiece of baking, medieval bread was born of necessity and fire, not convenience. It rose not from thermostats and timers, but from skill, guesswork, and hard-won instinct. And it fed a world that asked for endurance, not delicacy. Beneath the ashes, the bread of the medieval world took shape. Not in silence, but in smoke and sweat and patience. The history guy here. Beneath the high banners of a medieval manor, past the great hall with its roaring fire and carved oaken tables, through the winding passageways where servants scurried like shadows, there lay a space few guests ever entered, but without which the entire estate would crumble, the kitchen. And in the kitchens of the nobility, unlike the peasant hearth, cooking was not just survival. It was performance, it was power, it was politics, prestige, and pageantry, baked, boiled, spitted, and stewed in quantities that beggared belief. To feed a lord and his household was no small task. A noble's kitchen might serve dozens of retainers, guests, servants, visiting clerics, wandering minstrels, and hawk trainers, sometimes all in the same day. The master's table expected meat twice daily, wine at every meal, pies filled with venison or pigeon, custards, fruits and syrup, spiced wine, gilded bread. Behind this feast was a hidden army: cooks, scullions, turnbroaches, larderers, pastrymen, spit boys, wood-bearers, and stewards. Dozens of workers, sometimes over 100 in great households, each with a narrow task, each obeying a strict chain of command. The kitchen was not one room, but many. A boiling house, a pastry room, a buttery for drink storage, a spicery for precious ingredients, a larder for cold storage, a scullery for washing, a bakehouse sometimes detached to prevent fires. In the largest manors or castles, these spaces were spread out, connected by courtyards or corridors, all centered around the kitchen proper, a vast, smoke-stained chamber with multiple hearths, fire pits, hooks, cauldrons, griddles, and stone ovens where they existed. But even with this complexity, there were no modern comforts. No running water, no refrigeration, no lighting beyond flickering torches. The floors were stone, the walls slick with grease. Rats were an ever-present nuisance. Fires were dangerous and unpredictable. The smells meat, fish, onions, spices, sweat hung thick in the air. At the heart of the operation stood the maître quart, or master cook. This man, always a man, well then a chef. He was a manager, an accountant, a keeper of schedules and menus. He oversaw purchases, inventory, cleanliness, and the delegation of every task. He answered directly to the steward or the lady of the house, and he bore the blame if a feast failed or a roast was late. Menus in noble houses were unlike anything seen in the villages. Meals were multi-coursed and lavish. A dinner might begin with potage or broth, followed by boiled meats with mustard, roasted game birds, stewed fruits, custards, and subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures made from sugar, marzipan, or pastry. One surviving menu from a 14th century feast included swan, heron, eel pie, quince jelly, almond milk custard, and candied fennel seeds. but luxury required logistics. Meat had to be procured: venison from the forest, beef from the pastures, fowl from the dovecote, fish from rivers or distant ports. Wine and ale arrived by barrel, bread by the cartload from the bakehouse. Spices imported from as far as India or the Levant had to be stored carefully and weighed in tiny amounts. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, saffron, and sugar, considered a spice, had to be locked in chests and monitored by the spicerer. Salt was crucial, not only for flavor but for preservation. Large joints of meat were salted in advance, kept in cool rooms or cellars. Fish, too, was salted and dried. Without ice or cold storage, salting and smoking were the only defense against rot. Cooking techniques included boiling, stewing, roasting, baking, and frying in lard. Roasting was the most prestigious method. Spits turned endlessly over open fires. The spit boy, often a young boy or servant, was tasked with this grueling chore. In some kitchens, mechanical devices were used: weighted pulleys, or in rare cases, dog-powered wheels. Pastry was another noble obsession. Not the flaky dessert we know, but a dense, durable shell used to encase meat, fish, or fruit. Called a coffin, this pastry could be carved open at the table, releasing steam and scent before being discarded or eaten by the less discerning. Presentation mattered. A roasted boar might be served with an apple in its mouth, gilded with gold leaf. A pie might be baked with live birds inside to fly out upon cutting. Subtleties, those decorative sculptures, might take the shape of castles. Saints or mythical beasts paraded into the hall with fanfare. The kitchens operated on a strict calendar of feasts and fasts. Religious observances dictated menus. Fridays, Advent, and Lent required fish and meatless dishes. The cook had to adapt accordingly. On fasting days, almond milk replaced dairy, and fish, including preserved or freshwater varieties, became the mainstay. Inventiveness was key. Some dishes were designed to look like meat, even if they weren't, to please the eye while obeying the rules. Cleanliness, though difficult, was attempted. Water was drawn by hand for washing. Wooden trenchers were scrubbed with sand or vinegar. Cauldrons were scraped, ashes swept. Yet, by modern standards, conditions remained harsh. Infection and food poisoning were common. The line between food and filth was narrow. Training took years. A scullion might rise to become a cook. Apprentices learned by observation how long to boil a rabbit, how to test a pie's doneness by sound, how to slice roast goose with speed and elegance. Recipes were memorized, not written. Experience mattered more than education. And while the noble kitchen was rich, it was never wasteful by design. Leftovers were repurposed, bones boiled for stock, crusts given to servants or the poor. The Lord's table might glow with abundance, but beneath it, the kitchen strained under the weight of logistics and labor. The kitchen, in short, was a kingdom within the manor. Its own society, its own rules, its own hierarchy. It fed not just the body, but the idea of nobility, the belief that the Lord S house was a place of plenty, a center of power and a beacon of civilization. Thanks for watching. Medieval Cooking Calendar, Part 2. If you want to learn how to cook like a medieval chef, you have to know what they ate. And that starts with understanding their calendar. Last episode, we talked about how the Catholic Church intertwined so closely with people's daily lives back then. Well, that definitely affected what they put on their plates. I mean, remember, this is a time when most people are working in agriculture. Their whole life revolves around the planting, the harvesting, the weather, and the church telling them when they can eat what kind of food, well, that's just another layer of complexity. So let's start with how the calendar dictated what they ate. Medieval cooking was, above all, seasonal, and bound wrist and ankle to the church and the turning of the year. In an age without refrigeration, plastic packaging, or global food shipments, what one ate on any given day depended entirely on what could be grown, caught, preserved, or gathered within a few weeks' walk. The medieval kitchen bent to the will of weather, field, and faith. Spring brought its gentle promise. After the bitter hunger of winter, when salted meat supplies were low and root vegetables were shriveling in cellars, the return of green was nothing short of salvation. Sorrel, nettles, wild garlic, chives, and leeks would be the first to appear. Chickens laid again. Milk flowed from sheep and goats. Young lambs and kids were slaughtered for tender feasting. Eggs, scarce for months, became plentiful again. But this burst of life was shadowed by Lent. The church held the kitchen in an unyielding grip. Lent, a 40-day fast before Easter, was among the strictest seasons. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, no rich dishes. The cook had to pivot to fish, vegetables, nuts, and legumes. Almond milk replaced cow's milk. Olive oil or fish oil substituted for butter and lard. Recipes became clever illusions, mock meats shaped from mashed beans, faux cheeses crafted from ground almonds. Even hard-boiled eggs were mimicked with carefully shaped fish paste. Then came Easter, with it a culinary resurrection. Roasted meats returned to the table. Cream, butter, and sweet custards reappeared. Hams, salted the previous autumn, were pulled from storage and boiled or baked. Honeyed cakes were made in celebration. The agricultural year continued. In late spring and early summer, strawberries, cherries, and peas came into season. The kitchen turned lighter. Herb sauces, fresh greens, and delicate stews took center stage. This was also the time of dairy. Cheeses were made and stored for the leaner months ahead. Summer was generous, but it required preparation. Crops began to yield barley, wheat, rye, oats. Fruits ripened quickly and had to be dried, pickled, or turned into preserves. Berries, apples, and plums were gathered. Fish was salted or smoked. The long daylight hours were used for baking, brewing, and butchering. Late summer and early autumn marked the harvest, both a relief and a frenzy. Grain was cut and threshed. Vegetables were dug from the earth. Beans, lentils, and onions were pulled and hung. Cabbages were pickled or fermented. Mushrooms and nuts were foraged from forests. Nothing could be wasted. Every hand, even the smallest, had a role. The autumnal kitchen grew rich with stews and roasted fowl. This was the time for geese, pigeons, and ducks. Apples were pressed for cider, hops were dried for brewing, honey was collected. The fields and forests gave their final gifts before the cold set in, but none of this abundance could distract from what was coming winter. The medieval kitchen in winter was a place of cunning. With the fields frozen and gardens dead, only stored and preserved goods remained. Salted meats, smoked fish, pickled vegetables, dried fruit. A peasant might eat the same pottage, a thick soup of beans and grains for days or weeks. Spices, for those who could afford them, became a lifeline to flavor. The feast of Christmas stood like a roaring fire in the middle of winter's dark. It was the ultimate culinary celebration. For those who could afford it, there were roasted boar's heads, spiced wines, meat pies, and honeyed cakes. Even the poor were given alms, sometimes bread, sometimes ale, sometimes a rare treat of meat. The lord of the manor might host a grand feast with dozens of dishes, from subtle sugar sculptures to jellied eels. But after Christmas came Epiphany, then Candlemas, and then the wheel began again. The religious calendar created a rhythm of feasting and fasting, of indulgence and abstinence. Fridays were typically meatless, so were many saints' days. In some years, nearly half of all days were days of fasting. The cook had to plan accordingly, maintaining stocks of fish, pulses, and dried goods for these times. Beyond religious obligations, there were feast days for social and political occasions, weddings, christenings, visits from nobility. These required immense effort. Special menus were planned months in advance. Exotic ingredients were procured. New recipes were devised to impress and delight. The feasts were not just meals, they were statements. On the other hand, lean times came not just from winter, but from poor harvests, war, or plague. Famine visited the medieval world frequently. In those times, cooks had to rely on desperation, bark ground into flour. Leaves, weeds, and roots made into soup. Rats, dogs, and birds became meat. Hunger was the great equalizer. Despite all this, medieval cooks, especially those in religious or noble households, kept seasonal books. They planned not just for the day or week, but for the year. How much grain to store, when to slaughter, how many cheeses to make, what herbs to dry, what ales to brew. Everything was done with the calendar in mind. Even feasting had its limits. Gluttony was considered a sin. The church preached moderation, though it rarely enforced it among the elite. Still, the kitchen was expected to balance abundance with reverence. In the end, the medieval cook worked not only with fire and food, but with time itself. Each dish was a reflection of the season, the feast, the fast, a reflection of the world outside the walls of the kitchen, the rains, the sun, the church bells, the turning earth. Today, we go to the store, we open a fridge, we microwave something in minutes. But in the medieval world, the cook's calendar was a sacred thing. A survival manual, a culinary compass, a mark of life's turning wheel. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this episode. If you'd like to support the channel and get some cool perks, please consider becoming a patron. Visit our page or click the join button in this video, and don't forget to subscribe. In the olden times, before the hum of microwaves and the quiet tick of electric ovens, there was only fire, crackling, roaring, unpredictable fire. Medieval cooking revolved around it, wrestling with it, waiting on it, fearing it, and mastering it. There were no thermostats, no knobs, no preheat alerts, just flame and ash, smoke and patience. At the center of every medieval kitchen was the hearth. A simple structure, often no more than a shallow fire pit built into the floor or stone base where logs were arranged and fire was born. In early medieval homes, the hearth was open and central, smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or not at all. Rooms filled with smoke, eyes watered, walls blackened. But this was cooking. Eventually, wealthier homes and castles built chimneys, drawing the smoke upwards and allowing fires to burn more efficiently. But even then, cooking was a smoky business. The scent of charred meat, burnt wood, and ash clung to every tunic and veil. Cooks were often seasoned in more than just herbs. The fire was alive, it required tending. A good cook knew her flame's temperament. When it was too hot, when it needed feeding, when it had grown sulky, coals were the true magic. Glowing red and steady, they offered the even heat needed for stewing, baking, and roasting. Fire was the tool, the ingredient, and the threat. To cook, one might hang a pot over the fire on a trammel. An adjustable metal hook attached to a beam or chain. It could be raised or lowered to change the heat. Pots were made of iron or bronze, soot black and heavy. Cauldrons boiled soups, stews, or gruels that simmered for hours, sometimes days. In wealthier homes, ovens were often integrated into the wall beside the hearth, but they were temperamental. Too much heat and bread would burn to charcoal. Too little and it would remain doughy. No one had a timer. Bakers judged readiness by instinct, smell, and the color of the crust. There were also spit roasts, a great symbol of status and feasting. In castle kitchens, massive fireplaces held iron spits that turned whole animals over open flame. In smaller homes, a joint of meat might be skewered and slowly rotated by hand, often by a boy or servant, for hours. In some grand kitchens, a turnspit dog, a small breed trained to run on a wheel, kept the meat spinning evenly. Cooking required tools, most of them handmade, tongs, ladles, long spoons carved from wood or cast in iron, skillets and griddles, clay pots and glazed jugs. Everything was heavy, everything was hot, and then there was the smoke. It filled every corner. It blackened walls, ceilings, even food. It seeped into hair, clothes, and lungs. Kitchens were not clean white spaces. They were dark, shadowy, and fire-lit. Even with a chimney, a kitchen might be choked with haze for hours. Many cooks developed chronic coughs or eye problems from long exposure. Yet fire offered more than just heat. It gave flavor. The smoke curled into meats, lent a char to bread, enriched stews with a depth that no spice could match. A roast cooked slowly over wood fire was a sensory triumph, crackling skin, dripping fat, the golden hiss as juices hit coals. Controlling the fire became a kind of artistry. If too hot, food burned. If too cold, it spoiled. Some cooks learned to create different heat zones by arranging embers strategically, coals on one side for boiling, a cooler area for keeping dishes warm. Stones were heated and placed in pots for slow cooking. Bread ovens were tested by tossing in a bit of flour to see how quickly it browned or burned. For baking, cooks might build a simple cloche oven. A clay or metal dome placed over bread near the fire, mimicking a true oven. Others buried pots in ashes or nestled them among glowing coals, covering the lids with embers to cook from all sides. Fire was used for more than just cooking. It boiled water for cleaning, heated rooms, and dried herbs and meat. Ash from the hearth could be mixed with fat to make soap. It was central to life, a constant presence, and a potential danger. Chimney fires were common. A stray spark could destroy a thatched roof cottage in minutes. In monasteries, kitchens were often better planned. Many were separate buildings, reducing fire risk. Monks developed some of the first chimneyed cooking hearths, allowing for more precise heat control. They also wrote down cooking methods, giving us rare insights into medieval technique. But even the best kitchens were a world apart from modern standards. There were no sinks, no countertops, no insulation. Floors were dirt or stone, vermin scurried in the shadows. Water had to be drawn, wood chopped, fires built from scratch. Every meal was labor. Yet, in spite of, or perhaps because of the hardship, medieval cooking with fire had a romance. It was raw, direct, primal, a connection to the earth, to the hunt, to the harvest. It demanded respect and attention. You could not set it and forget it. You had to sit with it, feel it, taste it, smell it. And so, in the smoky kitchens of medieval manors and peasant huts, cooks built entire meals with just open flames and instinct. They forged flavor in the furnace, crafted cuisine without gas, without electricity, without modern convenience, just fire, wood, stone, and time. Today we open our fridge to find food ready to eat, whether it's been there a few hours or a few weeks. But until the advent of refrigeration, people had to preserve their food, not just cook it, to keep it safe and edible. This required knowledge, skill, and a lot of patience. In the Middle Ages, seasons ruled all, and food came not in abundance but in bursts. Spring brought forth greens, summer fruits, autumn grains, and winter brought nothing. Without a plan, a family could starve before the snow melted. So medieval cooks turned to the old elements salt, smoke, earth, and air to keep their food from rotting. Preservation was a daily ritual, a seasonal occupation, and sometimes a community event. Salt was the most important tool. Now we're used to the soft table salt, but back then it was coarse, crystalline, sometimes gray or pink. Scraped from salt pans, dug from mines, or boiled from brine, salt was power. Wars were fought over it, fortunes built on it. To possess salt was to possess time itself, for salt could halt decay. Meat was packed in salt, layer upon layer, covered and pressed, often in barrels or ceramic crocks. The salt drew out moisture, creating a hostile environment for bacteria. This could preserve beef, pork, or fish for weeks or months. Some meats were salted dry, others brined in strong, salty water. Salted cod, known as stockfish, became a staple across Europe, traveling from northern coast to inland towns. But salt was expensive. Not everyone could afford it, so came smoke. Smoking meat and fish was a slower process, but equally effective. Hung above a low smoldering fire, often fueled with green wood or herbs, food absorbed smoke over days. This not only dried the surface, but infused it with antibacterial compounds. Smoked bacon, hams, and sausages hung from the rafters of cottages, sometimes so long they turned black and hard. Still, when stewed or boiled, their flavor was unmatched. In many homes, the same hearth used for cooking doubled as a smokehouse. Hooks dangled from beams, and a dedicated smoke week might see the whole household working to prepare meats for the winter. This was often done after slaughter, usually in November, before deep cold set in. It was a grim but necessary tradition: blood, brine, and billows of smoke. Dairy, too, had to be preserved. Milk soured quickly, so it was turned into cheese. Soft cheeses were eaten quickly. Harder varieties, pressed and aged in cool cellars, could last months. Butter was salted and stored in jars or wrapped in cloth and buried in cool places. Fruit was dried, strung on threads, or laid on racks in the sun. Apples, pears, and plums shriveled into leathery treats. In some monasteries, ovens were used to gently dry fruit after bread had been baked. It was efficient and no waste was avoided. Grains were easier to store, but only if kept dry. Granaries were built above ground with ventilated floors to prevent dampness. Rats and weevils were constant enemies. Peasants checked sacks regularly, sometimes placing ash or herbs inside to repel pests. Spoiled grain could mean famine. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were stored in pits, called clamp stores, dug into the ground, lined with straw and covered with soil. These underground cellars were nature's refrigerators, staying cool and moist. Potatoes had not yet entered Europe, but similar methods preserved onions, garlic, and leeks. Fermentation also played its part. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Fruit became wine or vinegar. Honey was mixed with water to create mead. These were not just culinary choices, they were acts of preservation. Vinegar was used to pickle vegetables, eggs, even meat. Wine was both a drink and a disinfectant. Cellars, if a family was lucky enough to have one, were cool and dark, ideal for storage. Clay jars, glazed jugs, and wooden barrels lined the walls. They were marked not by labels, but by memory. A good housewife or steward knew what was where and for how long. Spoiled food was not just unfortunate, it was waste, shame, and risk. Preservation wasn't always successful. Entire stores could spoil due to poor weather, a rat infestation, or a failed batch of salt. In lean years, food was stretched. Bread was made with acorns or beans. Old meat was boiled with vinegar to mask the taste. Hunger drove invention, but it also killed. The church calendar helped shape preservation practices. With over 150 days of fasting, days when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, families planned their food stores accordingly. Fish was essential, and preserving it became a necessity. Pickled herring, dried eels, smoked trout all appeared in winter meals when flesh was banned. Even beer played a role. Water was often unsafe, and beer, brewed quickly and drunk fresh, offered hydration and nutrients. Grain that might spoil was turned into ale, giving it new life. In some regions, women managed the household brew, their knowledge of fermentation passed down like sacred texts. So whether it was curing, smoking, salting, pickling, fermenting, or drying, each method was a battle against spoilage, a testament to human ingenuity. Preservation was not a separate act from cooking, it was part of it. Every dish bore the mark of its journey, the saltiness of salt pork, the tang of pickled eggs, the chew of dried pears. These flavors define medieval cuisine, not as a choice, but as a necessity. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, check out others like it. And if you want more, don't forget to subscribe. Spring arrived with unseasonable greenery, a palate cleanser after the long, hungry days of winter. It was not a season of feasting, but of delicate beginnings. The first shoots and herbs were precious nettles, sorrel, watercress, and dandelion leaves. These bitter greens were often the first fresh things to enter the pot in months. They were boiled or stewed into thin soups, sometimes flavored with last year's salted meat if any remained. After the lean months, everyone's stores were low, even the animals. Eggs returned to the diet as hens began to lay again, and fresh milk flowed from goats and cows. This was a time of simplicity, of small joys, of tentative color returning to the plate. Summer was the season of effort. The land worked hard, and so did the people. This was the time of sowing, tending, and watching the skies. If the weather turned, if rain flooded the barley or drought withered the beans, there would be consequences come winter. Summer meals were often lighter, eaten in haste between tasks. Fresh vegetables like peas, onions, leeks, and early carrots made their way into stews or were eaten raw in small amounts. Fruits such as cherries and strawberries ripened for a brief time and were either eaten fresh or preserved immediately boiled with honey, dried, or turned into vinegar. But summer had its dangers. Without refrigeration, fresh food spoiled quickly in the heat. Butter melted, milk soured, meat turned. So cooking often meant boiling or baking to ensure safety. Dishes were rustic and functional. Breads were flatter in hotter weather, and beer fermented more rapidly, sometimes with unpredictable results. Still, summer was a time of abundance if the harvest looked promising. Then came autumn, the queen of the medieval kitchen. It was the great moment of gathering. Everything that had grown, ripened, or matured was now taken in. Grains were harvested and threshed. Apples and pears dropped from the trees. Beans were dried and shelled. Cabbages were pulled and buried or pickled. And most importantly, animals were slaughtered. This was not a cheerful event. It was grim and bloody, but it was necessary. Livestock could not be fed through winter unless they produced milk or offspring. So pigs, cattle, and sheep were culled, and their meat preserved through salting, drying, smoking, and pickling. Autumn was not only a season of food, but a season of work. Every member of the household took part in preserving, storing, and planning. Kitchens were full, busy, and chaotic. The smell of smoke, brine, and boiling fat hung in the air. Autumn was the cook's moment to shine. It was now that the cleverness of the kitchen could be seen in pies filled with preserved fruit, in pottages thick with root vegetables, in puddings made from suet and grains. Spices, if they could be afforded, were used now to add depth and warmth. Cooks knew this was the time to prepare for scarcity, and then inevitably came winter. Winter was not a cooking season, it was a consuming season. Fires burned low to save wood. Hearths were quiet. Meals were made from what had been put away salted meat, dried beans, stored onions, cabbage, and hard cheese. Bread was coarse, often stretched with oat or barley flour. A thick soup might last several days, refreshed with a little stock, a bit of grain, or a few dried herbs. This was when the rhythm of the year pressed hardest on the kitchen. Nothing fresh, nothing green. The same flavors repeated endlessly. Smoke, salt, sour, and earthy. Meals were heavy and plain, made to last. Boiled puddings, root mash, and stewed lentils were common. A feast at Christmas might bring temporary abundance, a slaughtered pig or a rare roast butt for most of the season. Survival was the goal. The church calendar intersected with this seasonal rhythm. Fasting days were observed more strictly in spring and winter, when food was scarcer anyway. Lent, the 40-day fast before Easter, came at the end of winter when animal products were already low. It required cooks to be ingenious with fish, grains, and vegetables. On feast days, preserved treats were brought out: honey cakes, dried apples, smoked eels. But even with the church's structure, nature ruled all. A late frost, a poor harvest, a disease in the pig herd, any of these could tip a family into hunger. So the medieval cook was not just a preparer of food, but a manager of scarcity. They were strategic, observant, patient. They watched the sky. They knew when to gather, when to ferment, when to salt. Cooking in medieval times was an act of deep seasonal awareness. Recipes did not exist as they do now. Instructions were passed down orally, but the rhythm, what to eat when, was written into the body. One knew when cherries were ripe by the birds, when the cow's milk sweetened by the grasses, when it was time to dig for leaks by the frost in the ground. The cookess calendar was not hung on a wall, but lived in their mind and their senses. They could feel the turning of the year in the air, in the soil, in the taste of the broth. To eat out a season was not a privilege, it was an impossibility. And so the meals of the medieval world were a quiet, humble reflection of time itself. As the seasons turned, so did the cooking pot. From fresh greens to stored grain, from milk to hard cheese, from fresh meat to dried sausages, every bite was a marker of the year's journey. There was no rush, no shortcut. Only the steady, ancient march of sun and soil echoed in every dish served at a simple wooden table. There's no better way to know a culture than through its food. And in medieval Europe, the staff of life was bread. But the story of medieval bread is complicated. Sure, everyone ate it, but what kind of bread you ate and how it was made told an even bigger story about who you were. Let's see how bread revealed the realities of life in medieval Europe. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly was bread? Well, medieval bread wasn't the same as the stuff you pick up at the store today. For most people, bread was simply the staff of life, a cheap, filling food made from flour, water, and yeast, which was cooked by baking the dough until it hardened into something that looked like this. No fancy cuts or shapes here. Medieval bakers didn't put much effort into making their loaves look pretty. Instead, they focused on making them last as long as possible. After all, bread was an expensive investment of time and money. Making it was a big deal. Flour had to be milled, the dough had to be kneaded, it had to be baked, and then kept fresh for as long as possible. And because so much work went into making bread, it was usually saved for special occasions. Like when Queen Isabella hosted Edward I at a banquet in 1269, Edward got a fancy loaf made with fine white flour and spices. Most people didn't get such extravagant loaves. Their bread was dark and coarse because they were made with whatever flour they had on hand, which was usually a mix of wheat, rye, and barley. And because flour was so expensive, medieval cooks stretched it into as many loaves as they could. That meant their loaves were hard, heavy, and dense because they were full of seeds and grain. And it also meant that bread was usually a weeknight food. Unlike today, when we often eat bread with meals, medieval folk didn't eat their bread with butter and jam at the breakfast table. Instead, they ate it for dinner, dipping it into their evening broth or porridge to soak up extra liquid and add some substance to their meal, too. Now, you're probably thinking that this doesn't sound so good, but remember, for medieval folks, bread was more than just a tasty treat. It was a symbol of sustenance and life itself. 3. Okay, now let's talk about how bread got on the table. Getting bread from farm to family was a long process. Grain had to be ground into flour, and that took time. Not only did farmers have to grow wheat, rye, or barley, they had to take it to the nearest mill to be ground. And the person who owned the mill charged the farmer for the service. He might accept payment in kind, meaning he wanted more grain to keep his mill running, or he might want cash. Either way, the farmer came out behind. Because of the expense and the work involved in milling, most families needed to take their grain to the Lord's mill. Suspicions of the miller ran rampant. People believed that millers cheated customers by pocketing some of the grain for themselves. So, farmers tried to keep their loads as light as possible on their way to the mill. To do that, they sewed grain into bags made of linen, which they then tied off tightly. On the way to the mill, they pretended to carry heavy loads, but they kept their voices low so the miller couldn't guess how much grain they actually had. Then, once their grain was ground, they repeated the process in reverse. They carried empty sacks to the mill and pretended to fill them slowly, keeping their eyes on the miller the whole time. Was this paranoia justified? Sometimes. Millers were notoriously greedy and abusive. In 1354, the English Parliament even investigated charges that millers were adulterating their flour by throwing in whatever they had on hand, plaster, bones, and sawdust. 4. Finally, once the flour was milled and the dough was ready to bake, the family had to get it to the oven. And this posed a whole new set of problems. Building an oven was expensive and difficult, so most families didn't have their own. Instead, they brought their loaves to the nearest communal oven, which was usually in a public bakehouse. The problem was getting there first. If you arrived early, your bread would be burned. If you arrived late, it would be raw inside. There was also the danger of other women and children snatching your bread before it was done. All of these dangers meant that baking days were serious business. Women arrived at the bakehouse early, carrying their loaves with identifying marks on top, and waited for the previous batch of bread to finish baking. Once their turn came, they slid their loaves into the oven and crossed their fingers that they would rise properly. V. So was eating bread worth all this trouble? You bet. For medieval Europeans, bread represented the difference between life and death. Without it, there was no way to store food for the winter months. And with a bad harvest, families could go hungry. That meant that even the worst loaf of bread was something to be thankful for. And when times were good, a perfect loaf could feed a family for days. In the end, bread was more than just food. It was a symbol of sustenance, a marker of class, and a representation of life itself. And that's why eating bread was such a big deal in the Middle Ages. Hey, thanks for watching. The year is 1348 and you are thirsty. You find yourself in a medieval village, fields stretching as far as the eye can see, but the water there is not safe to drink. Villagers tell you to come closer. By their well, they warn travelers of contaminated streams and rivers. City water may look pure, but is a slow-acting poison. So what do you drink? If you're thirsty in the Middle Ages, your only choice is ale. Welcome to my channel. In the medieval world, water was not always safe to drink. Streams and wells were often contaminated, and city water could be a slow-acting poison. So what did people drink? More often than not, they drank ale. Brewed in kitchens, monasteries, taverns, and manors, ale was as common as bread. In fact, in some households, the two were made side by side, kneaded dough on one table, fermenting barley on another, Ale, not to be confused with later hoppy beer, was a mild, often cloudy drink made from water, malted grain, and yeast. It was not meant to be aged. It was consumed fresh, sometimes the same day it was brewed. For the medieval peasant, a cup of ale at breakfast was not indulgence. It was hydration, calories, and warmth. The process began with malting, the careful sprouting and drying of barley or oats. Grain was soaked in water, allowed to germinate just enough to unlock sugars, then dried in the sun or over low fires. This malt was then crushed and mixed with hot water to create a sweet mash known as wort. The wort was boiled, then cooled, and yeast either saved from a previous batch or captured from the air was added. After fermentation, the ale was ready. There were no bottles and few barrels. Ale was stored in jugs, pots, or wooden casks and ladled out when needed. It did not keep long, just a few days before souring, so brewing was a near constant task. Many women, especially in rural areas, were alewives brewing small batches for family, neighbors, or sale. Their presence was marked by the alistake, a pole with a cloth or garland hung outside to signal fresh ale within. Ale was thick, nourishing, and relatively weak, usually 1 to 3% alcohol. It was safe for children, the elderly, and laborers who needed refreshment in the field. Stronger brews were made for festivals, religious feasts, or wealthier patrons. These were often mixed with honey, herbs, or spices, creating a richer drink known as braggot or mead, especially where honey was plentiful, but not everyone drank just ale. Water, when safe, was preferred by the wealthy who could afford leaden pipes to bring fresh water into their homes. Wine was a luxury good, imported and expensive. And cider was popular where orchards thrived. For many, though, ale was not just drink, it was life. A poor laborer might consume up to 2 gallons a day. Breweries and alehouses provided jobs. And for those who tended the brews, ale was a constant companion. Now let's talk about boiling. We don't think of it much, but for our medieval ancestors it was a wonder of the ancient world. Boiling water was easy, but boiling food took time and fuel. Yet in a world without stoves, the medieval hearth was the center of all cooking, and boiling was among the safest and most reliable techniques. It required no fine control of temperature, just a pot and flame, and allowed food to be made tender, safe, and digestible. The cauldron or kettle, usually made of cast iron or bronze, was suspended over the fire or nestled among the coals. Some were massive, able to cook for entire households or communities. Others were small and portable. They boiled water, milk, grains, vegetables, and meat. Anything that could simmer became a meal, from thick porridges to hearty stews. Boiling was the default. For poorer families, a single pot might cook everything for the day. Into it went barley, beans, leeks, cabbage, or whatever was available. Meat, if present, was often old or tough, best softened by slow boiling. Bones were prized not for their flesh, but for the broth they produced, simmered long to release nourishment. These were the medieval stews known as pottages, endlessly varied, rarely written down and always evolving from one day to the next. In wealthier homes, boiling had greater variety. Whole birds, pigs' heads, sausages, and fish were all boiled with care. Spiced broths were flavored with pepper, saffron, vinegar, wine, or herbs. Cooks experimented with sweet and sour combinations, creating complex dishes like blancmange, a mix of chicken, rice, milk, and almonds. To boil well was a mark of culinary skill. But boiling was not just about taste, it was about safety. In a time when rotten meat was common and bacteria unknown, boiling ensured survival. It sterilized water, softened food, and created dishes that could be shared, reheated, or stretched over days. The smell of a bubbling pot was not just comforting, it was protective. Boiling was also central to preservation. Fruits were boiled down into syrups. Milk became curds. Honeyed wines were boiled to clarify them. Even soap and medicine began at the boil. In every medieval kitchen, whether grand or humble, something was almost always simmering. Boiled dishes, like drinks, were communal. People ate together from the same pot or bowl, dipping with wooden spoons or pieces of bread. There were few individual portions, no refrigeration, and no second helpings once the pot was empty. Meals were not scheduled by the clock, but by hunger, harvest, or the readiness of the pot. And just as boiling dominated food, brewing dominated drink. In cities, ale was big business. Taverns and inns sold it by the jug, and the church taxed it heavily. In monasteries, brewing became an art. Monks perfected strong ales, aged in barrels, and carefully documented their recipes. Some even added early hops, unknowingly inventing the ancestor of modern beer, but not all were pleased. Authorities worried about drunkenness, spoiled ale, or dishonest brewing. Ale tasters were appointed in towns to sample batches and find those who sold weak or sour drink. The assize of ale, a regulation akin to the assize of bread, set prices and standards. Bad ale was not just a personal failing, it was a social threat. Over time, ale evolved. Hops were added to preserve it, techniques improved. But in the medieval centuries, ale was still a household affair. Brewed in the same kitchen where bread rose, where cauldrons simmered, and where firelight flickered, it was as essential as water and more trusted than wine. It was in these hot, smoky kitchens with their soot-stained beams and boiling pots that people shaped their world with what little they had. Brewing and boiling were not luxuries. They were the backbone of life. So, next time you lift a pint or simmer a stew, remember the hearths of the past, the alewives and fire tenders, the boiling pots and bubbling brews, the labor and love behind each sip and spoonful. In every drop and every ladle, a memory of medieval life lingers. Before the sun had climbed high enough to warm the fields or the baker had stoked his oven, someone was already working in the medieval kitchen. Not with knives or fire, but with milk. This humble, perishable liquid drawn fresh from cows. Goats or sheep was at the heart of a quiet but vital culinary tradition, the making of butter and cheese. Without refrigeration, medieval people faced a simple truth. Milk could not wait. Left alone, it would sour, curdle, and spoil. But transformed, it could feed a household through lean winters and meatless fasts. Dairy was not just a byproduct of farming, it was a culinary art. It was a daily chore, and in many homes, the most reliable source of protein. The process began with milking, usually done by women or children. The cows, low yield and small by modern standards, produced only a few quarts each day. Goats and sheep offered even less. But what they gave was precious. It was carried quickly to the kitchen or dairy room, often a cool, shaded corner of the home or a separate building entirely, designed to stay cold and dark. If the milk was left to stand, cream would rise to the top. This thick layer, skimmed carefully, became the base of butter. It was poured into a churna, simple wooden container with a plunger, crank, or paddle hand worked steadily. The motion broke fat globules apart and forced them to clump. After perhaps half an hour, the cream would suddenly separate into butter and buttermilk. A moment known to every medieval dairy maid as a minor miracle. The butter was then needed to remove liquid, salted for preservation, and shaped into pats or balls. In warmer months it would sour quickly. In colder weather it might last a few weeks. Wealthier homes stored it in stone pots buried underground or submerged in spring water. Poorer homes simply ate it while they could. But for long-term survival, butter wasn't enough. That's where cheese came in. Cheese could be mild or sharp, fresh or aged, soft or hard. The basic method was simple. Milk was warmed gently and curdled either by natural souring, by adding rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach, or by mixing in vinegar or herbs. The curds were separated from the whey, then pressed, salted, and aged. These cheeses were often soft, crumbly, and tangy. Hard cheeses were rarer, requiring careful aging and ventilation. But even a simple cheese was prized portable protein, ideal for fasting days, travel, or storing in the larder. Monasteries became famous for their wheels and rounds. Cistercians, for instance, were known across Europe for their smooth, pale wheels of cow's milk cheese. Among peasants, the dairy was often women's work. It required patience, timing, and a delicate touch. A misstep, a churn too slow, a press too hard, a curd too warm could ruin everything. Yet little was wasted. Even the watery whey left behind was fed to pigs or mixed into porridge. Butter was also used beyond the plate. It softened bread, flavored vegetables, and even appeared in medicinal recipes where it was mixed with herbs to make salves. In northern climates, where olive oil was scarce or non-existent, Butter was essential for both cooking and body care. Cheese, too, could be more than food. It featured in trade, dowries, and gifts. A noble might send a wheel of aged cheese to a neighboring lord as a token of peace or alliance. A farmer might pay rent partly in cheese. In some towns, cheese fairs were held markets bursting with rounds, wedges, and wrapped bundles, each with its own local style. Not all cheese was elegant. Some was strong, even pungent. A traveler in the Middle Ages might describe a Region S cheese as hard as stone or smelling of feet, yet even these were valued. They were resilient, transportable, and nutritious. And in a world where hunger was always near, that was enough. There were dangers, too. Milk that soured unexpectedly could sicken. Butter contaminated by dirty hands could spread disease. Rats were attracted to dairy stores. Even butter could go rancid, giving off a rank, unmistakable stench. But these risks were part of daily life. In noble kitchens, dairymaids and cheesemongers were respected roles. Large estates might have whole rooms devoted to butter and cheese. Great households demanded variety fresh butter for spring feasts, aged cheese for winter stores, goat's cheese for Lenten fasts. In cities, cheese and butter were sold in markets alongside meat and bread. There were regulations, prices fixed, weights checked, quality inspected. Fraud was punished. A vendor selling cow-s milk cheese that was mostly sheep-s milk could face fines or worse. But for most, dairy remained a quiet craft, practiced at dawn and forgotten by midday. The churn turned as roosters crowed. The curd set while bread was needed. A good batch meant food for days, even weeks. A bad one meant loss, hunger, or shame. Today, butter comes in tidy blocks and cheese in plastic wrap. But in medieval kitchens, they were born of sweat, timing, and touch. They came from the land, from the animals tended with care, and from the hands of those who learned by repetition and ruin how to make milk last. So when we think of medieval cooking, we must think not just of fire and pots, but of churns and presses, of cool rooms and warm hands, of soft curds and salted slabs. In the quiet work of butter and cheese, a whole world of skill and survival once turned. It's harvest time. You've reaped your crops, gathered your fruits, and cured your meats. All around you, friends and neighbors do the same. In the fields, the air hums with activity. Laughter mingles with the swish of scythe and flail. It's a time of plenty, a time to celebrate. And then, as quickly as it began, the season turns. Summer's warmth fades into autumn's chill. The days grow short. Snow blankets the fields. The familiar bounty of the market stalls begins to dwindle. Soon, people will rely on the stores they prepared in the sunnier days. The salted fish, the dried fruit, the jars of pickled vegetables. For medieval households, winter posed a stark choice, feast or famine. The answer lay in the humble larder, pantry or cellar, places filled with the ghosts of summer, where the muted colors of dried herbs mingled with the quiet weight of salted meat. As the last apples were plucked from the tree and the final bundle of herbs was tied and hung, medieval households turned their attention to one of the most crucial and unglamorous culinary tasks, preservation. Unlike the bountiful feasting days of harvest and the cheerful bustle of communal baking, preservation was a silent, urgent labor. Because in the months ahead, when snow-covered fields and daylight dwindled, the larder would stand between a family and starvation. There were no freezers, no plastic wraps, no vacuum-sealed jars. But medieval people had their own arsenal: salt, smoke, cool stone, and patience. First, let's look at salt. This was no mere seasoning. Salt was power. It preserved meat and fish, ensured survival, and was taxed heavily, controlled tightly, and valued like currency. Coastal salt works or inland salt mines, such as those in Salzburg, became the engines of trade and wealth. For many towns, the flow of salt was the flow of life. To preserve meat, it was rubbed, packed, or soaked in brine, a salty water solution. Pork, the most common meat, responded well to this method. A butchered pig might yield dozens of cuts, all of which needed urgent curing. Hams were salted, then hung. Bacon was packed in wooden barrels layered with brine. Sausages were stuffed with spiced ground meat and cured in smokehouses or drying lofts. Beef and venison could be similarly treated, though they were less common among the poor. Hunters and nobles might preserve game for feast months later. In monasteries, entire rooms were devoted to salting fish or aging cheese. And then there was fish a necessity during the long stretches of fasting days when meat was forbidden. Fresh fish spoiled quickly, but salted herring, cod or eel could last for months. These were packed into barrels and shipped across Europe. A peasant in Bavaria might eat salted herring from the North Sea. A monk in France might dine on Icelandic cod. Smoking was another pillar of preservation. Meats were hung over smoldering fires, allowing the smoke to dry and flavor them while discouraging spoilage. The smokehouse was often a low, dark hut or a section of the kitchen with a constantly smoldering hearth. Woods like oak, apple, or beech gave meats distinctive flavors. Smoked sausages, hams, or eels might hang for weeks before being wrapped in cloth and stored. Fruits and vegetables had to be preserved differently. Without canning, medieval cooks relied on drying, fermenting, and storing in root cellars. Apples and pears were sliced and dried on racks near the fire or in the sun. Plums became prunes, grapes became raisins, and even elderberries might be dried for winter stews. These fruits lost their fresh sweetness but became valuable sugars in the cold months. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips were buried in sand or straw in cool, dark cellars. Cabbages were fermented into sauerkraut. Beans and lentils were dried and stored in sacks, safe from rot if kept away from moisture and rats. Grain, the backbone of survival, was carefully stored in granaries, raised structures designed to keep out pests and damp. Rats were the great enemy, and every village knew the cost of a spoiled store of wheat or rye. Barrels, bins, and tightly sealed clay pots helped preserve dried grains, flours, and meal. Even eggs could be preserved coated in wax or stored in lime water. Butter was packed into crocks and stored in cool spring houses. Some even sealed jars of butter under water, a primitive but effective form of refrigeration. Honey, when available, was its own preservative. Fruits were sometimes boiled in honey to make preserves, what we might call jam. These sweetened treats were rare luxuries but highly prized, especially in noble homes. In wealthier households, preservation was almost ceremonial. Whole teams of kitchen staff were employed to process and store harvests. Detailed records were kept: how many salted hams, how many barrels of pickled cabbage, how many loaves baked and dried for the winter. In castles and manor houses, larders and pantries were specially designed with thick stone walls, narrow windows, and earth floors to keep food cool. Meat hooks lined the ceilings. Cheese ripened on wooden shelves. Honey and wine were stored in massive clay jars or oak casks. In monasteries, food preservation was a matter of spiritual discipline and practical survival. Monks recorded curing techniques, pickling recipes, and drying methods. Some monasteries became centers of food science, innovating ways to stretch the harvest through fasting months. For peasants, preservation was more intimate, done by hand with urgency and thrift. A single family might preserve only what they could not eat. Failure to do so meant not just hunger, but ruin. Winter was cruel to the unprepared. So they boiled fruits to concentrate their sugar. They sliced apples thin to hang in rafters. They salted every scrap of pork. They dried beans and wrapped butter in cloth. They poured vinegar over cucumbers. They buried cabbages and carrots deep in straw. Each technique was a small victory against the creeping rot, a tribute to the relentless march of winter. And each jar, each dried apple, each salted sausage represented not just sustenance, but hope. For medieval people, preservation was more than a culinary art. It was a fight for survival, a patient, meticulous war waged against the relentless march of time. The humble pie. We think of it as something dainty, perhaps a dish best served cold with a flaky, golden-hued crust that shatters at the touch of a fork. But in medieval times, the pie was a different sort of thing entirely. When we imagine medieval meals, our minds often drift to trenchers of meat, bubbling stews, and spit-roasted game. But in kitchens both grand and humble, one of the most enduring culinary tools wasn't made of iron or wood. It was dough. In a world without aluminum foil, Tupperware, or even ceramic baking dishes for the poor, the medieval pie crust did more than feed. It carried, preserved, and protected. These weren't just treats for feasting tables. They were the Tupperware of the Middle Ages, functional, edible, sometimes, and central to cooking without a kitchen as we know it. The crust of the medieval pie, especially the coffin, was thick, tough, and meant to hold in moisture and heat rather than to delight with flakiness. Often made with just flour and water, sometimes with the addition of hot fat, these dough casings were dense and durable. Bakers would construct these pies upright, filling them with meat, fish, or vegetables, then bake them to create a self-contained meal. In noble households, these coffins were often shaped like castles, animals, or shields, more a display of status than flavor. A pie shaped like a boar, filled with spiced pork, might grace the high table at Christmas. A fish-shaped pie, baked on a Friday or fast day, might be filled with eels and perch, seasoned with pepper and saffron. The crust was sealed tight, sometimes even varnished with egg yolk or clay to make it airtight. The ingredients sealed within such pies could last for days or even weeks, especially when the pie was stored in a cool place. The hard crust acted as both an oven and a fridge, keeping out insects, preserving the contents, and making transport easier. Travelers took pies on the road. Sailors packed them aboard ships. Soldiers carried them into battle. In humbler homes, the crust was just as important, though less ornate. Pies made with barley or rye flour, cheaper and more common than white wheat-held vegetables. Wild greens, bits of leftover meat or cheese. These were pasties, hand pies, pocket meals that could be eaten on the go or reheated over a hearth. The famous Cornish pasty may have later roots, but the idea of a hearty, sealed crust filled with nourishing fare was widespread long before it gained a name. Workers in fields and mines needed food that could withstand dirt, heat, and time. A pie sealed with tough crust and filled with onions, leeks, or salted pork was not a luxury, it was survival. And pies didn't always have to be savory. When sugar or honey was available, fruits like apples, pears, or plums were stewed and enclosed in dough, sprinkled with spices. Sweet pies marked festivals or holy days. Some were even served cold, their contents jellied and solid, but not every pie crust was meant to be eaten. Often, especially with large pies, the crust was discarded after serving, its job finished. In some cases, crusts were reused or fed to animals. There are even tales of crust sent to the poor, though it is hard to know how often this was done in practice. Pies were also entertainment. The infamous banquet surprise of 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie wasn't he just a nursery rhyme. Feasts sometimes included elaborate showpieces, huge pies with live birds or frogs enclosed inside, released at the table for astonishment and laughter. These were culinary theater, blending food and spectacle. But behind the scenes, pie making required skill. The dough had to be firm enough to stand upright, pliable enough to shape, and sealed tightly to prevent leaks. Bakers often used wooden molds or their own hands to shape and crimp the edges. In large households, there might be specialist bakers whose only job was crafting pies, each one a container, a meal, a work of edible architecture. The ovens used to bake these pies varied. In towns, communal bakehouses often included wide, stone ovens that retained heat for hours. Households would bring their prepared pies to bake, marked with symbols or initials to identify their own. In rural homes, pies were sometimes baked in the hearth itself, under a cloche or within a Dutch oven-style pot covered in embers. The sealed crust allowed the filling to cook evenly, retaining moisture and flavor. Pie making was also about stretching ingredients. A bit of meat, surrounded by root vegetables, bulked out with grains, made a more filling meal when enclosed in dough. A spoon of honey or dried fruit could turn leftover bread into a festive dessert. Nothing was wasted, and everything had a purpose. In monasteries, pies were often used to feed large groups. Fish pies were common on fast days, and cheese pies or onion tarts might be served during Lent. Recipes from medieval cookbooks like the Farm of Cury describe pies with raisins, almonds, saffron, and even edible flowers, showing that the medieval palate was far from bland. Some pies were boiled rather than baked, especially in areas without easy access to ovens. These pudding pies or suet pastries were cooked in cloth sacks or pots, yielding a soft, dense crust and warm, hearty filling. pies also served as gifts. A well-made pie filled with preserved game or sweetened fruit might be sent from one noble household to another as a token of respect or alliance. In cities, pies were sold in markets and streets, offering cheap, hot meals to the laboring classes. Over time, the pie evolved. The Renaissance brought lighter, richer crust. Sugar became more common, techniques improved. But in the heart of the medieval kitchen, the pie remained one of the most versatile, reliable, and essential creations. It was more than food. It was container, preservative, and canvas. In the absence of modern ovens, foil, and refrigeration, the pie crust solved problems that only flour, water, and ingenuity could. Today, we eat flaky pastry and talk of tradition. But for the medieval cook, pies weren't just delicious. They were practical magic. No countertops, no forks, no problem. Medieval peasants made do with what they had. Today, we not take a break from our series on medieval feasts and look instead at the quotidian meals of the peasant. When we think of medieval cooking, we imagine great halls, groaning with roasted meats, sugared tarts, and spiced wines. And yet, for most people in medieval Europe, those sumptuous meals only seasoned their imagination. For the vast majority of folks, existence was governed by the seasons, the weather, and their daily labor. And so the question remains, how did medieval people cook without kitchens? Well, first off, medieval peasants didn't really have time to cook. Far from the hearths of manor kitchens and bustling town bakeries, there were meals born of the soil itself, eaten under open skies, cooked over smoky fires and built from what the land allowed that day. For much of medieval Europe, the kitchen wasn't a room. It was wherever work happened, wherever the sun hung in the sky, and wherever hunger found its grip. So, to understand how medieval people cooked without modern kitchens, one must leave the image of stone walls and copper pots behind and walk into the fields. The medieval peasant's life revolved around the agricultural calendar. With dawn came labor, planting, weeding, harvesting, tending to animals. Time was marked by the tilt of the sun, and meals had to fit between tasks, not the other way around. No lunch breaks in the modern sense, just brief pauses to eat what had been packed at home or foraged nearby. Breakfast was rarely a hot meal. A piece of coarse rye bread, maybe with a smear of lard or cheese, was eaten cold as workers walked to the fields. At midday, a more substantial meal might be cooked outdoors if time and weather allowed. And here we need to be clear, the vast majority of medieval peasants were not dining out in fancy restaurants. Life was hard, and being a customer was a luxury few could afford. Still, there were times when a midday meal was more than just bread, cheese, and fruit. Field cooking was rudimentary but clever. Workers brought with them the barest tools, a clay pot, a wooden spoon, maybe a knife. They built a small fire using twigs, dried dung, or gathered wood. Over this, a simple pottage could be simmered, a stew of grains like barley or oats, with onions, herbs, and if one was lucky, a piece of salted meat or a handful of legumes. Sometimes this stew was started at home in the morning and finished in the field. The long, slow cooking of pottage made it perfect for such flexibility. It could simmer as they worked, stirred when someone had a free hand. If firewood was scarce, stones might be heated in a fire and dropped into the pot to keep the contents hot without constantly feeding the flame. Foraging played a central role in supplementing these meals. Nettles, dandelion leaves, wild leeks, mushrooms, and sorrel were gathered and tossed into the pot. Berries and crabapples sweetened porridge. Hazelnuts or acorns, once ground, could bulk up bread or soup. Every hedgerow was a potential pantry. In mountainous regions or isolated villages, entire meals might be prepared outdoors for shepherds, woodsmen, and charcoal burners who stayed far from home for weeks. They cooked with what they carried or found: cheese, flatbread, dried beans. A popular dish was ashes-baked bread dough flattened and buried under hot coals, then brushed clean and eaten warm. In more forested zones, meals centered around what nature gave. Roasting sticks were a universal tool, for bread dough twisted into spirals for wild birds or fish caught nearby. No pans. No kettles, just flame and stick and patience. Communal work also meant communal eating. During harvest or haymaking, the whole village turned out men, women, children. At midday, they might gather for a shared meal, a cauldron suspended over a fire, filled with whatever each person had contributed. These collective meals weren't just for sustenance. They reinforced the social fabric of the village. Even the manor lords, when overseeing their fields or on hunting expeditions, would dine outdoors, though with more elaborate fare. Their cooks would prepare cold pies, cured meats, bread, and wine, all transported with care. Fires might be built by their servants to heat wine with spices or roast freshly caught game. Weather dictated everything. In warm months, field meals were almost pleasant sun, air, and food. But in winter or during sudden rains, people huddled under trees, cloaks over their heads, trying to eat something warm before it went cold. Sometimes food was eaten standing or while walking fast meals with no fire at all. In marshy regions or places with poor soil, outdoor meals were even more dependent on ingenuity. Reeds might be woven to hold fish over a flame. Turtles, eels, or frogs could be cooked directly in coals. Not every dish had a name. Many were born of necessity and forgotten by nightfall. One tool used in field cooking was the posnet, a small, three-legged pot of iron or bronze, easy to set atop coals. Its portability made it a favorite for meals on the move. With it, one could cook porridge, fry eggs, or boil water for weak ale or herbal teas made from mint, chamomile, or fennel. Bread was always present. Baked days before it traveled well. If it hardened, it could be dipped in pottage or ale. If it molded, it was fed to pigs or turned into crumbs for another dish. Nothing went to waste. Food was rarely served on plates. Instead, people used flat stones, leaves, or their hands. A hunk of bread served as both plate and spoon. Drink was often shared from a single jug. Hygiene, by our standards, was sparse. But in a world where survival mattered more than cleanliness, such details faded behind hunger. And yet, within this rough context, there was poetry. Meals under the open sky, beside rows of wheat, with the hum of bees and the rustle of trees, had a kind of sacred rhythm. The cook fire became a hearth in the wilderness, the pot a symbol of community. Evening brought the last meal, if there was time. By then, workers had returned home, but in peak seasons, they might still be in the fields. Leftovers were reheated or bread and cheese eaten cold. Children nibbled crusts. The fire was doused, the pot was cleaned with straw or sand. Then silence returned. The field, once full of hands and fire and steam, went dark. Today, we cook in kitchens of steel and tile. We measure temperature, set timers, and store leftovers in plastic. But long ago, a fire in the grass and a handful of barley made something just as vital. They cooked without countertops. They ate without forks. But they lived by the flame, and the field was their table. You've heard me talk about medieval feasts and banquet foods before, so today I want to explore what more common folks ate, how it was prepared, and what it tasted like. When we think of medieval food, our imaginations run wild with images of roasted swan, spiced goose, and sugared fruits. This was the food of kings and queens, of aristocrats and merchants, but not of the vast majority of people who lived in medieval Europe. If you were an average medieval person, your meals would have been simple and centered around grains, vegetables, dairy products, and whatever meat you could afford. Your food would have been plain and perhaps even bland, but it would have tasted like home. Salt was a precious commodity in the medieval world. It was a mineral of wealth, traded across continents and heavily taxed, so it wasn't freely available to everyone. Salt was used to preserve food rather than season it. Fish was salted and dried to last through the winter. Meats were packed in salt to keep them edible and were often soaked or boiled to remove the brine before being eaten. This means that if you were near a coast or had access to fresh fish, your food would have tasted salty. Vegetables, grains, and stews might have been sprinkled with salt, just enough to enhance their natural flavors without transforming them. If you lived far from the coast or in areas where salt was scarce or taxed by the crown, your food would have been much less seasoned. Spices such as cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger were almost mythical in their rarity. They were imported from Asia by way of Italy, the Middle East and North Africa, and traveled along trade routes that were fraught with danger and diplomacy. Prices were measured by the ounce in silver, and a single clove could cost as much as a day's wages. So, if you were part of the nobility, you may have enjoyed cinnamon in your wine or cloves in your meat dishes. But for most people, spices were unknown or extremely rare. Onions, leeks, and garlic were staples in medieval cooking, and they grew easily in most regions. Wild garlic was especially prized in the spring. Leeks went into everything from broth and stew to porridge and soups. These alliums were pungent and enduring, and they became the backbone of medieval cooking in the absence of spice. Herbs were another common seasoning. Rosemary, sage, thyme, and parsley were some of the most popular, and they were grown in cottage gardens or gathered in the wild. Some herbs were even believed to help with digestion or ward off illness, so they were used in both food and medicine. Mustard was a popular condiment made from locally grown seeds. It was ground into a paste and mixed with vinegar or verjuice, which was sour grape juice. Mustard was coarse and fiery, and it gave flavor to cold meats, salted fish, and bland grains. It was cheap and easy to store, so it was found on many medieval tables. If you had access to dairying animals, your diet would have been richer and more complex. Soured milk and cheeses added tang and depth to meals. Buttermilk, whey, and curds were used in a variety of ways. Soft cheese might have been stirred into a stew or served alongside bread. And in monasteries, where fasting rules restricted meat, cooks experimented with ground almonds or pulses to mimic the texture and richness of meat. They used pickled vegetables, sharp cheeses, and rich broths to compensate for the absence of flesh. A beverage could also add flavor to a meal. Ale, mead, and cider were not just drinks, but they were also cooking ingredients. A splash of ale in a stew gave it body and bitterness. Cider sweetened fruit dishes or helped tenderize meats. Even the dregs of brewing, the grain husks and leftover yeast, might be used in porridge or bread. Occasionally, nature itself provided bursts of unexpected flavor. Smoked meats, preserved not just for survival, but for flavor, carried the scent of wood and ash. A bit of wild honey might have sweetened your porridge or glazed a root vegetable. Apples, plums, and dried cherries, when added to stews, brought complexity and contrast. So what did medieval food taste like? It depended on where you lived, what you could afford, and what season it was. But for most people, it was not the explosion of flavors we associate with good food today. It crept in, subtle, earthy, and often bland. But it was real, known, and steady, tied to the rhythm of the land. Occasionally, though, something rare might appear, like a pinch of caraway brought by a traveler, a slice of gingerbread gifted by a merchant's wife, or a few dried peppercorns saved for Christmas stew. These moments became stories passed down like heirlooms. The memory of a taste lingered long after the flavors faded away. Medieval peasants did not have ovens, at least not in their homes, and so the question is, how did they bake their bread? What's the secret to making loaves without an oven? Well, the answer lies in the fire. In the heart of every cottage or hovel, a fire was always burning. It was essential for warmth, for cooking, and for baking, though not in the way we think. Brick ovens were the luxury of the manor or monastery, not the humble villager. So how did they manage? Let's find out. For starters, most peasants didn't have personal ovens. Ovens were large, communal, and expensive to build. Constructed from clay and brick, these domed structures had thick walls to hold heat. A fire was lit directly inside the chamber, heating the stones and walls until glowing. Once hot enough, the coals were swept out and the bread placed on the warm stones to bake in the residual heat. But not everyone had access to such an oven. Many villages had one shared oven, perhaps managed by the lord's estate or by a communal baker. Peasants would prepare dough at home and walk it to the oven, paying a fee in coins or bread. Some lords even claimed a banal right, charging serfs to use the oven they were forbidden to build themselves. This meant many were forced to improvise. Flatbreads were the simplest solution. Made with coarse flour wheat, rye, oats, or barley and water, these breads required no yeast and no rising. The dough was rolled flat and cooked on a hot stone or iron griddle set directly over the fire. These were quick, versatile, and could be eaten warm or dried for later. Such breads varied by region. In the north, barley and oat cakes were common. In the south, coarse wheat might be used when available. These weren't the fluffy, light breads we're used to today, but were dense, chewy, and nourishing. A dependable staple when little else was on hand. The griddle became the peasant's oven. A flat slab of iron or thick stone. It was heated by the fire and used to cook not just bread, but pancakes, porridges, and even stews and thick pastes. For those who had the means, a clay or ceramic baking dome called a cloche could be inverted over a flatbread and covered with embers. This trapped heat creating a rudimentary oven-like space. The technique was known to the Romans and passed down in rural traditions. The bread baked slowly beneath the dome, crust forming in the dry heat, the smoke adding flavor. Another method was the hearth bake. This involved heating a flat stone near the fire, then placing a risen dough upon it and covering it with an iron lid or pot, which was then piled with coals. This created an oven within the fire, allowing for slow, even baking. These breads were heartier, slightly risen, tougher crusted, and closer to what we imagine as a proper loaf. Still, most peasant breads were not leavened at all. Yeast was difficult to control and maintain in a humble kitchen. Instead, they relied on sourdough, a fermented mixture of flour and water kept alive with daily feeding. This starter was passed through generations, a living heirloom in wooden bowls or clay pots. Baking bread with sourdough required patience. The dough was mixed, rested for hours, shaped, and then cooked over or near the hearth. The result was tangy, dense, and often sour enough to shock a modern palate. But it lasted, and it filled the belly. The flour used was rarely white. Millstones produced coarse, bran-rich flour with bits of grit and husk. This gave the bread a dark color, a rough texture, and a shortened shelf life. But to the medieval palate, this was normal. White bread was for the rich a status symbol as much as a food. Interestingly, many lower-class breads were mixed, part wheat, part rye, part oats, even part peas or beans ground into flour. These loaves were called mazzelin bread from the Old French mezzlin, meaning mix. Nutritious if not elegant, they provided more fiber and protein than modern loaves. In monastic settings, baking was more refined. Monasteries often had proper ovens and employed skilled bakers. Their loaves were round, well-kneaded, and uniform. They supplied bread for the monks, for charity, and for sale. Some made fine white loaves for noble patrons and rougher ones for the poor. In towns and cities, professional bakers emerged, especially by the 13th and 14th centuries. These bakers maintained ovens, managed yeast cultures, and sold bread daily. Regulations governed their loaves. Weights were inspected, prices controlled, and quality monitored. A baker who shorted a customer could be fined or publicly punished. But the majority of people still baked by their own fire, and women were the bread makers in the home. They rose early to grind grain, knead dough, and keep the fire going just right. And so while they may not have had ovens, they had the next best thing, the communal oven, the griddle, or the hearth. And they used every tool and technique available to turn simple ingredients into nourishing loaves and flatbreads. Bread, after all, was more than just food. It was necessity, symbol, and routine. It was the staff of life. And to the people of the Middle Ages, it was worth any amount of work and waiting. I hope you enjoyed learning how medieval peasants baked their bread without an oven. If you did, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. So, the first time I ever heard about famine food, it was my grandma telling me about growing up during the Great Depression. She said that sometimes they would go to bed hungry, but her mother would always give them something to settle their stomachs, a bit of oil and vinegar to drink before going to sleep. Hi, I'm here with Minute Earth. Now, I've been thinking about my own empty stomach and the idea of famine food. You know, the stuff people eat when there isn't any other choice? And I started wondering, what did people eat in the Middle Ages when they had nothing else to eat? Well, it turns out that famine was a regular visitor in the Middle Ages. It stalked the peasantry as surely as plague or war. There were years when the fields did not yield. Years when rain came too early or too late. Years when locusts came or the armies passed through. And in such years, cooking became survival, and meals were crafted not out of preference or tradition, but out of what could be scrounged, begged, stolen, or spared. When livestock vanished, as they often did, grain stores were raided or burned, orchards and vineyards trampled. The countryside suffered most, but even towns felt the sting of scarcity. When trade routes collapsed or siege walls closed in, food became currency, and those without paid in flesh or freedom. In the 13th century, a German chronicler wrote of people living on nothing but roasted mice and dormice, lizards, frogs and toads, while an English writer described how in his day cat and dog meat was a common dish. He wasn't kidding. Throughout the Middle Ages, cats, dogs, rabbits, pigeons, poultry, pigs, cattle, sheep, deer, horses, and donkeys were routinely slaughtered for food. During the Siege of Orleans and the 100 Years' War, residents reportedly ate dogs, cats, rats, and sparrows. And in 1596, people in London were recorded as eating cat, dog, and horse meat. People living in famine didn't just eat animals, though. They ate whatever they could get their hands on. In the mid-14th century, English chronicler John of Fordun wrote of men so starved that they did eat the flesh of the dead, which is commonly called the eaters of the flesh of the dead, or anthropophagi. Yikes. But the most common meal in times of famine was probably broth. Broth made from what? Everything and anything went into the pot? Herbs and weeds, berries and nuts, tree bark, the insides of animal carcasses, even sawdust and plaster. Sometimes the only things that were available. One recipe from the 16th century calls for the broth made from the ashes of burnt grain, mixed with water, chopped straw, and chopped hair. Sounds appetizing. But even during famines, people still gathered in kitchens, open fires in courtyards, or flickering hearths in crumbling cottages. They passed around wooden bowls and shared what little they had. Maybe that's why even during the worst of times, people still referred to their meager meals as dinner, supper, or victuals. Hunger made food sacred. Even inside monasteries, where food was usually plentiful, strict rationing was enforced. In times of famine, the supply of food was unpredictable, and monks had to stretch their meals to last weeks or even months. A contemporary of Shakespeare's wrote of the diet of English monasteries in the mid-16th century. Gruel made from beans or lentils was served with crusts of bread, a little wine with each meal. Bread was usually soaked overnight in water or beer to make it last longer. These foods might sound bland, but they were staples of medieval cooking. Even after adding spices or flavorings, they were filling and nutritious. Monks weren't the only ones sharing their food. Across Europe in the early 14th century, when famine and the Black Death ravaged the continent, something remarkable happened. People started sharing food together in communal kitchens. As we've seen, even a small amount of food could last longer if it was shared, but there's more to the story. Medieval people saw themselves as members of a community, and they knew that everyone in that community needed food. They also believed that sharing food would bring them closer together and help them through hard times. But maybe most important of all, there was a religious reason. Sharing food brought people together, reminding them of the Last Supper and Jesus' teachings about caring for the less fortunate. So despite their hunger, medieval Christians remembered to care for one another. And that's pretty amazing. By the late 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, the medieval world was beginning to change. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The hum of the old rhythms, the daily grind of grain, the quiet crackle of hearth fires, the simmering of stews passed down through centuries was beginning to fade into something new. This part of the story is not about sudden revolutions or grand inventions. It is about subtle transitions. The dying embers of the medieval kitchen and the first glimmers of the modern hearth. We begin in the wealthy urban households where new money flowed from trade and architecture began to shift. Houses once organized around a single smoky great hall began to divide into distinct rooms. Kitchens were no longer always part of the communal space. Instead, they were tucked away separate, specialized, and staffed. The open hearth, the very heart of medieval cooking, began to change shape. Chimneys had already started to appear centuries earlier, but now they became more refined, more widespread. Smoke was no longer the permanent companion of the cook. With improved flues and masonry, the air cleared. For the first time, kitchens became truly rooms, not just smoky corners. This changed everything. A cleaner kitchen meant more attention to technique, more complex dishes, more tools. Iron grates and suspended pots gave way to ranges, ovens built into brick. Roasting jacks devices that turned meat on spits were powered by weights or even small dogs running in wheels. Precision, previously the domain of monasteries and noble kitchens, trickled slowly down, but this transition was slow. In rural areas and among the peasantry, the old ways endured. The pot over the fire, the kneaded loaf in the ash, the wooden spoon, the earthenware bowl. These were not abandoned, but layered with change. A new kind of pot, a different kind of flour, a fruit from another land. Indeed, the age of exploration, the very thing that would bring about the modern world, was quietly transforming food itself. From the late 5th-10th century onward, the ships that sailed from Portugal and Spain began to bring back strange and powerful ingredients. Peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, cocoa, vanilla fruits of conquest and colonization, but not all at once. And not all welcomed. Tomatoes, for instance, were long considered poisonous. Potatoes were viewed with suspicion. New foods had to be folded into the old traditions slowly, cautiously. Often it was the elite who experimented first. Peasants, wary of change, clung to the familiar. Yet once these new ingredients were accepted, they transformed the kitchen. New stews, new sauces, new kinds of bread and porridge. These were not medieval foods. They belonged to a new world. Though they would be cooked over the same old fires for generations, technology followed trade. Metalwork improved. Cast iron pans became more durable. Cooking pots came with fitted lids. Griddles, waffle irons, baking tins, all signs that cooking was becoming not just a survival skill, but a craft. In towns, public bakeries began to evolve. Once, the local oven was a lordly monopoly, taxed and regulated. But in time, these became more accessible, even commercial. Bread became a commodity. Cooks became professionals. Meanwhile, cookbooks once rare began to multiply. Previously, culinary knowledge passed through oral tradition or in scribbled notes in monastic margins. But now, with the spread of printing, recipes were copied, compiled, sold. The first printed cookbooks were mostly for the elite, but they marked a shift. Cooking was now something that could be studied, repeated, perfected. And still, in the corners of the countryside, the medieval kitchen lived on. A clay oven built into the earth. A cauldron hung from a blackened hook. A bench worn smooth from generations of kneading. The smoke of peat or wood curling up into the rafters. The rituals endured, morning bread, evening stew, the borrowed spice saved for feast days. What began to disappear was not the food itself, but the world that gave it meaning. Guilds dissolved. Manor economies faded. The feudal obligations that tied people to lords and thus to certain lands. Certain ovens, certain kitchens began to crumble. People moved. Cities grew. With them came new kitchens, new markets, new ways to cook and eat. In time, fire itself would change. Coal, and later gas, would replace wood. Stoves would become sealed boxes with dials and temperatures and precision. Pans would shine with tin and copper. The art of slow cooking, of listening to a pot, would give way to the clock and the timer. But this was still centuries off. As the medieval era closed, what lingered was the deep knowledge people carried in their hands. How long to soak barley. How to test bread by ear. How to smell when a stew was ready. These were not written down. They lived in the rhythm of daily life, passed from mother to daughter, father to son. In the silence of the evening, when the day's labor was done, the fire would be banked, a stone or iron lid placed on the pot, bread cooling on a board, children gathered around scraps and stories. The kitchen simple, smoky, dim was more than a place. It was memory, and so the medieval kitchen did not end all at once. It faded slowly, quietly, like the dying coals in a hearth at midnight. But its influence endures. In every soup cooked slowly. In every loaf shaped by hand. In every meal that is more than nourishment, something remembered, something shared. Because long before stainless steel and microwave ovens, before blenders and convection fans, there was only the fire, and those who knew how to use it.